Nobody leaves my table hungry. Emily Carter tore the $56 receipt in half before she even finished the sentence, her hands shaking her manager's angry footsteps already coming down the hallway behind her. And she had no idea that within 72 hours, 300 motorcycles would surround her house at dawn, and the man leading them would kneel in her driveway and thank her for something she'd already forgotten she'd done. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because this one gets bigger than you think. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Rain hammered the tin roof of the Blue Pine Diner like it was trying to break through. Emily Carter stood behind the counter wiping down the same 6 inches of Formica for the third time in 10 minutes, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed something to do. Her feet throbbed inside shoes that had given up arch support 2 years ago. Her back ached in that dull, permanent way that comes from standing 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. She glanced at the clock, 9:42 p.m., 18 minutes until closing. "Come on," she whispered to herself, "just 18 more minutes." She'd already done the math 3 times that day. Rent was $640 due in 4 days. She had $580 saved if she counted the emergency 20s stuffed in the coffee can behind her son's baseball. Trophies, $60 short. $60 that felt some nights like $60,000. Some nights. Her son Tyler was 17. Good kid. Quiet the way boys get when they've watched their mother carry too much for too long. He wanted to go to Bridger Technical College in the fall, a 2-year mechanic program, hands-on real trade, real future. Tuition deposit was due in 6 weeks. $350 just to hold his spot. Emily hadn't told him yet that she didn't have it. She hadn't told him a lot of things. The bell above the diner door jingled, and 5 men walked in from the storm like something out of a nightmare that hadn't decided yet if it wanted to be a nightmare. Leather jackets soaked through, beards dripping, boots tracking mud across the linoleum Emily had mopped 40 minutes ago. Patches on their vests. Skulls wings red and white insignia she recognized immediately because everyone in 3 counties knew what those colors meant. Hell's Angels. Behind her in the kitchen, she heard the clatter of a pan hitting the floor. Ruth, the night cook, had dropped it. "Emily," Ruth hissed through the pass-through window, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, get back here." Emily didn't move. The 5 men stood just inside the door, dripping onto the mat, and for a moment nobody said anything. The diner's ancient jukebox crackled through the end of a Patsy Cline song. Rain kept hammering. The man in front was older than the others, maybe late 50s, gray threaded thick through a beard that reached his collarbone, eyes the color of wet slate. He looked at Emily the way a man looks at someone when he's bracing for a door to be shut in his face. "We know how this looks," he said. His voice was low, rough, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. "We won't cause trouble. Just need somewhere warm for an hour, if that's all right." Emily looked at him, really looked. She'd waited tables for 11 years. She'd learned to read people the way other folks read weather quickly, instinctively, because your safety sometimes depended on it. And what she saw standing in her doorway wasn't danger. It was grief. It was 5 grown men who looked like they hadn't slept in 2 days, whose shoulders sat low under some invisible weight, whose eyes kept sliding toward each other like they were checking that the others were still standing. "Sit anywhere you like," Emily said. "Coffee's on me while you dry off." Behind her, Ruth made a small, strangled sound. The 5 men filed into the corner booth, the vinyl seats groaning under wet leather. Emily grabbed the coffee pot with hands that were only shaking a little now, and by the time she reached the table, she'd already decided something about the tallest of the 5, the one who'd spoken. There was a photograph tucked into the strap of his vest, laminated edges, worn soft from handling. She caught a glimpse of it as she poured a younger man, maybe 30, grinning at the camera, with his arms slung around a motorcycle. "Friend of yours?" Emily asked, nodding at the photo before she could stop herself. The man's jaw tightened. "Brother," he said. "Not by blood, by everything else." "Was," said the man next to him, quiet, staring at the table. The word landed in the booth like a stone dropped in still water. Emily set the coffee pot down slowly. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than diner manners. "I lost my husband 4 years ago. I know there's nothing anybody can say that fixes it, so I won't try." The older man looked up at her, and something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but opened like a door someone had been leaning their whole body against, finally easing off the frame. "Name's Jack," he said. "Jack Mercer." "Emily." "We buried Danny 2 days ago," Jack said. "Drove 11 hours to get him home to his mother in Wyoming. Spent everything we had on the funeral home, the flowers, gas to get everybody there. Didn't think about food till we were 3 states past broke." "You don't have to explain," Emily said. "I want to," Jack said, and something about the way he said it made her stay standing there instead of walking away. "Danny was 28, motorcycle accident on 93 weeks ago. Truck didn't see him. He had a little girl 4 years old, doesn't understand why her daddy's not coming home." Emily felt her throat tighten. She thought of Tyler at 4 years old asking her every night for 2 weeks after his father's accident when daddy was coming back from his trip. "What can I get you boys?" she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever's left in the kitchen, it's yours." Ruth caught her by the elbow the second Emily stepped back through the kitchen door. "Have you lost your mind?" Ruth whispered, eyes wide, flour still dusted on her forearms from the pie crust she'd been prepping. "You know who those men are. You know what Richard's gonna say if he finds out you gave away free coffee to a biker gang." "They're not a gang tonight, Ruth. They're 5 men who buried their friend 2 days ago. That's not the point, and you know it." "Then what is the point?" Ruth didn't have an answer for that. She just shook her head and turned back to the stove, muttering something about how kindness never once paid a light bill. Emily plated 5 burger specials with extra fries, poured 5 more coffees, and carried them out 2 trips because her arms weren't what they used to be. When she set the food down, Jack tried to press 2 crumpled $20 bills into her hand. "Take it," he said. "Please." "That's not enough to cover 5 specials," Emily said gently. "And I already told you it's on the house tonight." "We don't take charity," said the youngest of the 5, a broad-shouldered man with a fresh tattoo of a name Danny inked raw and red on his forearm. His voice had an edge to it, not at Emily, but at the world. "It's not charity," Emily said. "It's dinner. There's a difference." She walked away before they could argue further because if she stood there 1 more second, she was going to cry in front of 5 strangers, and she'd promised herself a long time ago that she didn't cry at work. Crying at work meant customers noticed. Customers noticing meant questions. Questions meant explaining. And Emily Carter did not have the energy to explain her whole life to strangers on a Tuesday night. She busied herself behind the counter, restocking napkin dispensers that didn't need restocking, refilling ketchup bottles that were already full. Anything to keep her hands moving and her eyes off that booth. But she couldn't help watching. She watched the 5 men eat in near silence for the first 10 minutes. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but heavy, full of things nobody wanted to say out loud. She watched Jack Mercer's hand tremble slightly around his coffee cup. She watched the youngest one, the one with the fresh tattoo, excuse himself and step outside into the rain, standing under the awning with his back to the window, shoulders shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Emily grabbed a spare jacket from the coat rack by the door, an old flannel one that belonged to no one in particular, left behind by some trucker 2 winters ago, and never claimed and carried it out to him. "Here," she said, draping it over his shoulders without asking. "Rain's not letting up." The young man turned, and Emily saw a face that couldn't have been older than 25, eyes, red-rimmed jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. "His name was Danny," he said, like Emily had asked, though she hadn't. "Danny Osgood. He was going to be a dad again. Second kid. His wife's due in March." "I'm so sorry," Emily said. "I keep thinking," the young man went on, voice cracking, "if we'd left the bar 10 minutes earlier, if we'd taken the back road instead, if I hadn't stopped to get gas." "Don't do that to yourself," Emily said, and something in her voice made him actually look at her. "I did that after my husband died, the if-onlys. They don't bring anybody back. They just eat you alive from the inside, one what-if at a time, until there's nothing left of you but guilt wearing your face." The young man stared at her for a long moment. Rain dripped off the awning between them. "How do you stop?" he asked quietly. "You don't, not all the way," Emily admitted, "but you learn to carry it different. You let it make you gentler instead of harder. That's the only choice you actually get." He nodded slowly, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and mumbled a thank you before heading back inside. Emily stood under the awning another moment by herself, letting the cold air settle her own nerves before she followed him in. By the time the five men finished eating, the diner clock read 10:15. 15 minutes past closing. Ruth had already started flipping chairs onto tables at the far end, casting Emily pointed looks that said, "Hurry this along." Jack Mercer stood, and the other four rose with him in instinctive unity, like soldiers responding to an unspoken order. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a thin, worn wallet, opening it slowly. Emily watched his face change. She'd seen that look before. She'd worn that look before more times than she could count. Standing at a gas pump, doing math in her head, standing in a grocery aisle, putting items back one by one. The particular quiet devastation of counting money that isn't enough. "We're short," Jack said, and his voice had lost all its earlier steadiness. "We paid for the funeral home. We paid for gas to get everybody home safe. We paid for flowers for Danny's little girl to put on the—" He stopped, cleared his throat, started again. "We've got $31 between the five of us. I know that's not near enough for what we ordered." The diner went quiet except for the rain and the low hum of the refrigerator case. Emily looked at the check in her hand. $56.14. She thought about her rent, 4 days away. $60 short, and here was a $25 gap staring her right in the face, a gap she absolutely could not afford to close out of her own pocket. Not this week, not with Tyler's deposit looming behind it, like a second bill she hadn't found the courage to worry about yet. She thought about Richard Hayes, her manager, and what he'd say if he found out she'd let a $56 tab walk out the door, uncollected. Richard, who docked her pay for a broken coffee mug last spring. Richard, who'd threatened twice to write her up for taking an extra 5 minutes on her lunch break to call the pharmacy about Tyler's asthma inhaler. She thought about all of it, standing there with the check trembling slightly in her hand. And then she thought about the young man outside in the rain, saying his wife's due in March, and Jack Mercer's trembling coffee cup, and the way grief had walked through her door tonight, wearing leather and looking for nothing more than a warm booth in a moment of being treated like a person instead of a threat. Emily set the check down on the counter. She picked up a pen, and in front of all five men, she tore the receipt clean in half. "Dinner's on me tonight," she said. "Nobody leaves my table hungry. Not tonight, not ever, not on my watch." Jack Mercer stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't recognize. "Ma'am, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Emily said, and her voice, to her own surprise, didn't waver. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, same as before. You don't even know us. I know you buried your brother 2 days ago. I know that young man out front has a name inked into his arm because it hurts too much to say it out loud without something to hold on to. I know grief when I see it, Mr. Mercer, because I've been wearing it myself for 4 years. That's enough knowing for me." The diner was silent. Even Ruth at the far end with a chair still raised in her hands had stopped moving. Jack Mercer looked down at the torn receipt on the counter, then back up at Emily, and something crossed his weathered face that looked almost like disbelief, the specific stunned disbelief of a man who has spent decades being braced for the world's cruelty and has just been handed instead an act of grace he has no idea what to do with. "Nobody's done something like this for us in a long time," he said quietly. "People look at these jackets and they see monsters. They don't see—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "They don't see men who just buried their brother." "Then those people aren't looking very hard," Emily said. Jack reached out and took her hand, both of his own wrapped around it, rough and calloused and warm, despite the cold rain still clinging to his sleeves. "I won't forget this," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever else happens after tonight, I will not forget what you just did." Emily managed a small, tired smile. "Get home safe. All of you. That's all the thanks I need." Bar. The five men filed out into the rain boots, splashing through the parking lot puddles, engines coughing to life one after another, until the low rolling thunder of 5 motorcycles faded off down the highway into the dark. Ruth finally set her chair down and walked over, arms crossed, studying Emily with an expression that was half exasperation, half something gentler she was trying hard not to show. "You know Richard's going to have your head for this," Ruth said. "I know. $56, Emily. That's not nothing. That's groceries. That's gas money." "I know, Ruth." Emily's voice cracked just slightly, the exhaustion of the whole day finally catching up to her all at once. "I know exactly what $56 is. I've been doing math in my head about $56 for the last hour." Then why? Emily looked toward the door, toward the rain, toward the direction the motorcycles had disappeared. Because somebody has to choose kindness, even when it costs them something, she said quietly. Otherwise, it's not really kindness, it's just convenience. Ruth didn't say anything else. She just reached over, squeezed Emily's shoulder once hard, and went back to flipping chairs. Emily finished closing alone, locking the front door at 10:47, standing under the diner's flickering neon sign for a moment in the rain, before walking to her car, a 14-year-old Corolla, with a check engine light that had been on so long she'd stopped seeing it. The engine turned over twice before catching the way it always did lately, a little rattle in the belt that she knew with growing dread was going to become an expensive problem sooner rather than later. She drove home through empty streets, rain streaking the windshield faster than her wipers could clear it, and she thought about the $25 gap she just created in a budget that had no room left to give. She thought about Tyler asleep at home, dreaming probably about torque wrenches and transmission rebuilds, no idea that his mother had just made his tuition deposit $65 further out of reach. And some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had gotten her through 4 years of widowhood, through 11 years of double shifts, through every impossible month that came before this one, that part of her didn't regret it, not for 1 second. She had no way of knowing driving home in the rain that night that Jack Mercer sat parked on the shoulder of Highway 90, not 10 miles from the diner engine, idling, staring at his phone, with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking. She had no way of knowing that he was scrolling to a contact he hadn't messaged in months, a group thread with a name at the top that read simply regional. She had no way of knowing that he typed 11 words into that message, sat with his thumb hovering over the send for almost a full minute, and then pressed it anyway. A waitress with nothing gave us everything tonight. This needs to be known. Richard Hayes arrived at the diner the next morning at 8:15, exactly as he did every morning, coffee in one-hand ledger tucked under his arm, wearing the particular scowl he reserved for days he'd decided in advance were going to go badly for someone. Today, that someone was Emily. "My office," he said the second she walked through the door, not even a good morning attached to it. Now, Emily's stomach dropped straight through the floor. She followed him into the cramped back office that smelled permanently of stale coffee and printer toner, and closed the door behind her, already bracing. "Explain this," Richard said, sliding last night's register tape across the desk, the torn receipt taped crudely back together beside it like evidence in a trial. "5 men came in last night," Emily said, keeping her voice level. "They just buried a friend. They were short on cash. I covered it." "You covered it," Richard repeated flatly. "With whose money, Emily? Because it sure as hell wasn't yours that went into this register. I know it comes out of the till. I was going to talk to you about it, offer to make up the difference from my $56, Richard cut in. "Do you have any idea what that does to my numbers? If every waitress in this place decides they get to hand out free meals whenever they feel sorry for somebody." They weren't just anybody, Richard. They were grieving. They'd buried. I don't care if they were burying the Pope. Richard's voice rose sharp enough that Emily heard Ruth's footsteps pause just outside the office door. "This is a business, not a charity. You do not get to make decisions like that without authorization. Do you understand me?" Emily's jaw tightened. 11 years. 11 years of never being late, never calling in sick, even the 2 times she probably should have, never once taking a tip from the jar, even on the nights she needed it most, because that money belonged to everyone who worked the floor. 11 years, and this was the conversation. "I understand," she said quietly. $56 comes out of your next check," Richard said. "And consider this your first written warning. One more incident like this, and we're having a very different conversation about your position here." "You're taking it out of my paycheck," Emily repeated, and something in her chest went cold and hollow. Calculating instantly, instinctively, rent was already $60 short, and now this. That's company policy for unauthorized comps. There's no policy taped to that wall about unauthorized comps, Richard. I've read every page on that wall. "There is now," Richard said, and the small, satisfied twitch at the corner of his mouth told Emily everything she needed to know about how much thought he'd put into inventing it right there on the spot. Emily stood very still for a long moment. She thought about arguing further. She thought about the 11 years, about how many times she'd covered someone else's shift, about how many nights she'd stayed late to help Ruth close, without ever once asking for overtime. She thought about how none of it would matter to a man like Richard Hayes. Understood, she said finally, and walked out of the office before he could see her hands start to shake. She made it exactly to the walk-in cooler before she let herself cry 3 minutes tucked between stacked crates of lettuce and a case of ketchup bottles, silent tears that she wiped away fast and hard with the back of her wrist because Ruth would be looking for her any second, and Emily Carter could not fall apart where anyone could see. When she stepped back out onto the floor, Ruth was waiting, arms crossed, face soft, with something like pity that Emily hated more than the anger. "He'd take it out of your check," Emily nodded, not trusting her voice yet. "That man," Ruth muttered, shaking her head, "is gonna answer for a lot of things someday. I just hope I'm standing there to see it." Emily managed a weak laugh despite herself. "Careful what you wish for." "I mean it, Em. Man like that treating people the way he treats you, treating everybody the way he treats you, it catches up eventually. Always does." Emily didn't answer. She just grabbed her apron off the hook and tied it back around her waist, because the lunch rush was coming, whether her heart was broken or not, and there were tables that needed setting and a boy at home who needed a mother who kept showing up no matter what. She had no idea tying that apron string with trembling fingers, that 300 miles away in towns and cities scattered across 4 different states, phones were beginning to buzz one after another, with a message that had started with 11 words and was already growing into something far bigger than Jack Mercer could have imagined when he sent it. "A waitress with nothing gave us everything tonight. This needs to be known." By noon, the message had reached over 60 riders. By evening, it had reached over 200. And Emily Carter, refilling ketchup bottles and wiping down booth 6 for the 4th time that day, had absolutely no idea that her small, quiet act of kindness, the one that had just cost her a warning, a docked paycheck, and a sleepless night of worry, was already setting something enormous into motion. Something that would arrive in exactly 3 days right outside her front door. The second morning after the funeral ride, Jack Mercer didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table of his small house in Billings with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him and his phone lit up in his hand, watching the numbers climb in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. 214 members across the regional thread had seen his message. 47 had already responded. Not with jokes, not with noise, but with the kind of short, blunt sincerity that men like these reserve for things that actually mattered. "Who is she? Where's the diner? What do we do?" Jack read each one slowly. He hadn't expected this. He'd sent that message the way a man shouts into the dark when something hurts. Not because he expects an answer, but because the silence is worse than the sound of his own voice. He'd been sitting on the shoulder of that highway, with the rain still coming down, and his hands still shaking from everything the last 3 days had been, and he'd thought about Emily Carter tearing that receipt in half, about the way she'd said, "Nobody leaves my table hungry," like it wasn't even a decision. Like it was simply a fact about who she was, and he'd needed someone else to know about it. He hadn't expected 214 people to respond overnight. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a private message, not the thread. A man named Big Carl Reeves, chapter president out of Missoula. Someone Jack had known for 22 years, a man who chose every word with the care of someone who didn't have many to spare. "Jack, tell me everything." Not the short version. So Jack typed it out. The whole thing. The rain, the diner, the torn receipt, the young waitress who looked at 5 soaking, wet, grief-wrecked men in Hell's Angels vests and saw only 5 people who needed to eat. He typed about the young man outside in the rain, Marcus, who had Danny's name tattooed raw on his forearm, and how she'd walked out to him with an old flannel jacket without anyone asking her to. He typed about the way her hands trembled slightly when she tore the receipt, the way she'd said, "I know exactly what $56 is," without elaborating, which somehow said everything. He typed for almost 20 minutes, then he sent it. Big Carl's response came back in less than 3. "She got family, she doing okay." And that was the question that kept Jack up the rest of that night, because the honest answer was he didn't know. He knew her first name. He knew the name of the diner. He knew the look on a person's face when they're stretching money they don't have, and he'd seen that look on Emily Carter from the moment she'd set their coffee cups down. He just hadn't thought to ask. By 6 in the morning, he'd made a decision. He pulled up the contact for a man named Dex Holloway, who was the closest thing the regional network had to an information specialist, which was a polite way of saying Dex could find out anything about anyone inside of 48 hours, and had never once used that skill for anything that crossed a line Jack wasn't willing to cross himself. "Need you to look into something for me," Jack typed, quietly. "A waitress at the Blue Pine Diner outside of Laurel, first name Emily, single mother. I need to know if she's all right." Dex's reply came back in 7 minutes. "On it." Jack set his phone down finally and stared at the cold coffee in front of him and thought about Danny Osgood's little girl who didn't understand why her daddy wasn't coming home, and about Emily Carter saying you let it make you gentler instead of harder. That's the only choice you actually get, and he thought that Danny would have liked her, that Danny had been one of the gentler ones, the kind of young man who embarrassed easily and laughed loudly and treated strangers better than most people treated their own family. He thought Danny would have wanted something done about this. That thought was what finally made Jack pick his phone back up and open the regional thread again. He typed, "I need to know who's in." Emily found out about the paycheck deduction on Thursday when she picked up her envelope at the end of her shift and stood in the parking lot doing math in her head that came out wrong no matter how many times she ran it. She'd worked 39 hours that week. At her hourly rate plus the tip pool, the check should have been close to $480. Instead, it was $398 and changed the deduction itemized at the bottom in Richard's small, precise handwriting, unauthorized comp, April 9th, $56. Per policy. She stood there long enough that Ruth came out looking for her, the older woman pulling her own cardigan, tight against the evening chill. And when Ruth saw Emily's face, she didn't say a word, just came and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "How bad?" Ruth asked finally. "I'm $142 short for rent." Emily said, the number coming out flat and strange the way numbers do when they have lost their abstract quality and become something immediate and physical. Something with weight. "And Tyler's deposit is in 5 weeks. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Then I've got 60 I can lend you. No interest, no deadline." "Ruth, don't you dare say no to me, Emily Ann Carter. Don't you dare make me feel bad for offering." Emily almost laughed. "Almost. I can't take your money." "Then consider it a loan and pay me back when you're able, and don't you think about it again until you are." Ruth reached into her purse, counted out 320s from her own thin wallet, and pressed them into Emily's hand before Emily could close her fist against it. "That's 60. Still a gap, but less of one. You'll figure the rest." Emily looked down at the folded bills in her palm. $60 from a woman who made the same hourly rate she did, who had her own bills, her own gaps, her own impossible arithmetic at the end of every month. "Why do you do this?" Emily said, and it came out more raw than she intended, less a question than a kind of wonder. "Because you do it for me," Ruth said simply. "You have done it for me, right? You think I forgot last February when my car registration came in and you slipped $40 in my jacket pocket and never said a word about it?" Emily had in fact forgotten. She'd put it out of her mind the way you put out of your mind things you do because they're right, not because you want credit for them. "Go home," Ruth said, patting her arm once firmly. "Hug your boy. Tomorrow's another day and you're not going to solve everything tonight standing in this parking lot." Emily drove home the long way, not because she needed to, but because she needed the extra 10 minutes of darkness and radio and the feeling of moving forward, even slowly, even toward nothing in particular. She had a country station on low, something old and unhurried, and she kept one hand on the wheel and one elbow on the window frame and let herself, just for those 10 minutes, not think about rent or deposits or Richard Hayes or the check in her purse. She thought about Jack Mercer, instead about the weight in his voice when he'd said brother. Not by blood, by everything else. And she thought there were worse things a person could be remembered for than being someone's everything else. Tyler was awake when she got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a textbook open in front of him and a YouTube video playing on his phone with the volume down low. Something about diesel engine repair, the particular patient absorption of a kid who'd found the thing he was meant to do and was already doing it in every free moment he had. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have given something away, because he immediately closed the textbook and said, "What happened?" "Nothing serious," Emily said, dropping her purse on the counter, keeping her back to him a beat longer than she needed to. "Long day." "Mom?" "Tyler." "You've got your math face on," he said, And when she turned around, he was watching her with a particular 17-year-old directness that sometimes caught her completely off guard, the way he'd inherited his father's inability to let a silence sit without pushing on it gently. The one where you're doing numbers in your head that aren't adding up. Emily looked at her son for a long moment. She thought about all the things she hadn't told him yet. The deposit, the widening gap in the account, the way she'd been running the diner's math against her own for 3 months now, trying to find rooms she couldn't find. "I'm fine," she said. "I promise." Tyler looked at her a second longer, then nodded slowly the way kids do when they've decided to believe something because the alternative is too heavy to carry. "Okay," he said. "There's leftover soup on the stove if you haven't eaten." She hadn't. She heated it up and sat across from him at the kitchen table while he went back to his textbook and they ate together in the quiet way they'd eaten together for 4 years. Two people who had learned the shape of each other's silences and found them comfortable. And Emily thought there were worse things in the world than this. There were so many worse things, and she needed to remember that. She went to bed at 10:30 and lay in the dark, doing math she already knew the answer to and didn't fall asleep until close to 1. Dex Holloway delivered his report to Jack at 7:15 Friday morning, and it was both better and worse than Jack had expected. Better because Emily Carter was exactly who she appeared to be. A woman of integrity, no debts beyond the ordinary kind, no drama beyond the ordinary kind, a woman who had worked at the Blue Pine Diner for 11 years without a single formal complaint lodged against her by management or customers. Worse because of what came with that last part. "She's clean as they come," Dex said over the phone, his voice carrying the particular clipped efficiency of a man who considered talking on the phone a necessary inconvenience. "Works doubles twice a week minimum. Has a boy, 17, solid kid by all accounts. Husband died 4 years ago, car accident. Life insurance was minimal. She's been running the whole show on waitress wages ever since." "The manager," Jack said, "Richard Hayes." A pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant something. "That's the more interesting part," Dex said. "You want the short version or the real version?" "Real version." Richard Hayes has been managing that diner for 8 years. In that time, 4 employees have left without collecting their final paychecks. Not because they didn't try, because they stopped getting responses when they did. 3 more have had wages docked under policies they can't find written anywhere for infractions that don't exist in the company handbook. He writes the weekly schedule 2 days out instead of the required 7, which means people can't plan second jobs or childcare. And he's the only one with access to the tip pool spreadsheet, which from what I can find, talking to 2 former employees off the record, has never quite matched what people remember counting at the end of their shifts. Jack was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me he's been stealing?" "I'm telling you what former employees have said off the record, and that nobody's ever been able to prove it because they were all too scared of losing their jobs to push on it. Emily Carter has been there 11 years. You do the math on what she might be owed." "Does she know any of this?" "She suspects something's off, probably. You work a place that long, you notice patterns. But suspecting and knowing are 2 different things, and knowing and being able to do something about it are 2 different things after that." Jack spent a long moment looking out his kitchen window at nothing in particular. He thought about a woman tearing a $56 receipt in half for men she didn't know, absorbing the punishment for it, without complaint going back to work the next morning, for a man who docked her pay and called it policy. He thought, no, not again, not one more day of this if I can help it. "How many people do you think you could get in contact with who've worked under Hayes?" Jack asked. "People willing to talk." Another pause. "Depends on what kind of talking you mean." "Legal kind," Jack said immediately. "I want this done right. I want this to stick. No shortcuts." "Give me 48 hours, Dex said. "I'll see what I can put together." "One more thing," Jack said. "She had her paycheck docked $56 for what she did for us. I want to know the total everything Hayes has taken from her over the years that she's owed and never received. Everything documented." "Jack," Dex said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried something that wasn't pure efficiency, something quieter and more human. "That woman have any idea what she started when she tore up that receipt?" "No," Jack said, "and I think that's exactly the point." By Friday evening, something had shifted in the regional thread that Jack couldn't have engineered if he tried. He hadn't put out a call for action, hadn't organized anything, hadn't asked anyone to do more than be aware of the situation. But 108 members across 4 states had been watching the thread quietly for 2 days, reading what Jack had written about Emily, reading the follow-up messages as they came in, and they had started independently to do what people in tight communities do when one of their own, or someone who deserved to be, had been wronged. They started talking. Not online, Saisfine. On the phone in parking lots in the back corners of bars and diners and garages. The kind of talking that happens when word travels through a network that's been built over decades of showing up for each other, that operates on a currency of loyalty and memory. A man named Garrett out of Bozeman called Jack at 7:30 Friday night. "I want you to know," Garrett said without preamble, "that I told my wife about this woman. And my wife, who does not have a sentimental bone in her body, I say that with love, my wife cried. She actually cried. And then she asked me what we're doing about it." "What did you tell her?" Jack asked. "I told her I was working on it," Garrett said. "Am I lying?" "No," Jack said. "You're not lying." "Good. I've got 11 guys from my chapter who want in on whatever this is. Don't need details yet. Just tell me there's a plan." "There's a plan," Jack said, because by this point there was. He'd spent the afternoon on the phone with a labor attorney in Billings, a man named Paul Steger, who worked with union disputes and wage theft cases, who had listened to everything Jack laid out and spent a full 30 seconds silent afterward before saying, "This is more common than you'd think, and if the former employees are willing to talk, there may be a very solid case here. Not just for Emily Carter, for everyone Hayes has taken from." "What would she need to do?" Jack asked. "She'd need to be willing to participate, and she'd need to know that these things take time, that they're not always clean, that her employer may retaliate before any of this is resolved." "She's already being retaliated against," Jack said. "She just doesn't know that's what to call it yet." A pause. "Bring me whatever Dex compiles. If it holds up, I'll take it on contingency. These cases I'll work on contingency when there's enough there." "There's enough there," Jack said. "I can already feel it." He hung up and sat for a moment with the weight of what was coming. Because here was the thing about setting something in motion. Once you did, you were responsible for where it landed. And Jack Mercer had learned in 58 years of being the kind of man people look to, that responsibility wasn't a thing you picked up and set down conveniently. It was a thing you worked away. He didn't mind the weight. He just wanted to make sure it landed somewhere that helped. He thought about calling Emily, then stopped himself. Not yet. Not until he had something concrete. He didn't want to walk into her life with half a story and a lot of intentions. He'd seen too many people show up with good intentions and create more chaos than comfort. When he went, he was going with something real. He opened the regional thread, typed slowly with care. "I need to know who can make the drive to Laurel on Saturday morning. I'm not asking for anything yet. I just need to know who's there. That's all." He set the phone down, poured the cold coffee down the sink, made a fresh cup. When he came back, there were 43 responses. 43. He sat down and read every name, every single one, and something in his chest tightened in a way it hadn't since he'd stood at Danny's graveside 2 days ago. Not with grief this time, but with something older and harder to name, something that felt, if he was being honest with himself, a lot like faith. Emily woke up Saturday before her alarm, which meant her body already knew the day was going to ask something of her before her mind had caught up. She lay in the dark, listening to the particular quiet of early morning, that specific stillness before the world remembered itself and started again, and she ran through her mental list the way she always did: bills, due money available, gap between them, time available to close that gap. Same list, different numbers, always the same arithmetic. She got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching the sky lighten at the edges while Tyler slept down the hall, and she thought about the $56, about Jack Mercer's hands around hers, when he'd said, "I will not forget this," about the way she'd meant it completely, when she'd said, "Get home safe. That's all the thanks I need." She still meant it, even now with the docket paycheck and the wider gap and the deposit clock ticking down. She still meant it. She just also meant that she was tired. She was so incredibly tired in that bone-deep way that isn't fixed by sleep, that comes from carrying too much alone for too long without anyone offering to take even one corner of the load. She heard it at 6:43 a.m. At first, she thought she was imagining it, a low, distant rumble that could have been thunder. Except the sky outside her window was clear. the kind of cold, sharp, early spring blue that doesn't produce thunder. She turned her head, listening harder, and the sound didn't fade. It grew. She set her coffee cup down. The rumble deepened, multiplied the specific, heavy sound of motorcycles. Not one, not five, but many, far more than she could easily count, growing louder as it approached her street, her block, her house, and Emily stood very still in her kitchen, with both hands flat on the counter, and thought, this is what impossible sounds like, before it stops being impossible. The sound stopped directly outside her house. Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks and an old sweatshirt, hair sideways from sleep, eyes wide and alert in a way that had nothing to do with being rested. "Mom," he said, "there are motorcycles outside, a lot of motorcycles." "I know," Emily said. "Like Mom, a lot." "I know Tyler." She moved toward the front door. Tyler was immediately beside her, shoulder to shoulder, because whatever this was, he wasn't letting her face it alone. And in that moment, Emily felt a fierce love for her son, so strong it almost took her breath away. She opened the door. The street was full. Motorcycles lined both sides as far as she could see in both directions. Riders standing beside them or still seated, dozens upon dozens upon dozens. And Emily stood on her porch with her coffee still in her hand and her 17-year-old son pressed close beside her and simply stared. And then the crowd parted down the middle, a clear path opening through it, and Jack Mercer walked through it toward her front porch. He was still wearing his vest. His gray beard was tucked against his chest in the morning cold. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her, and his face held the same openness she'd seen in the diner when she'd torn the receipt, that stunned, disarmed look of a man who'd prepared himself for one world and been handed a completely different one instead. "Jack," Emily said, and she was amazed at how steady her voice came out when everything else about her was shaking. "What is this?" "You told me get home safe," Jack said. "I did, and then I couldn't stop thinking about what I left behind." "What do you mean what you left behind?" "I mean you," Jack said simply. Emily Carter, a woman with a broken-down car and a docked paycheck, and a son who needs a school deposit who still didn't think twice about feeding 5 strangers on credit she didn't have. He paused. "I made some calls. I hope that's all right. I needed people to know what you did." Emily looked out at the assembled crowd, 300 people, maybe more, standing in the quiet of a Saturday morning on her ordinary street in her ordinary neighborhood, watching her with an attention that felt like it had weight to it. Why she managed, just that one word. Jack climbed the first porch step, closing the distance between them slightly. His voice dropped to something quieter, meant only for her. "Because most people in this world have been taught that men like us are to be feared. And you looked at 5 of us in the darkest week of our lives and treated us like we were worth something. And Emily," his voice thickened slightly and he cleared it, but he didn't look away. "People who do that deserve to have someone show up for them, even if it takes a minute." Behind him, 300 riders were completely silent. Tyler, beside Emily, said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Mom." Emily looked at her son. His eyes were very bright. He was doing the thing he had inherited from her, the thing she'd never quite taught him, but he'd learned by watching the tight-jawed, hard-blinking fight against tears in front of other people. "It's okay," she told him. And then she looked out at the crowd and said it louder for all of them because it's okay. Jack reached into his vest pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick sealed, and held it toward her. "This is from every person you see on this street," he said, "and a few dozen more who couldn't make the drive." Emily didn't take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him. "Jack, I can't." "You can," he said firmly but gently, the way she herself had said, "You don't have to explain in the diner. Because we're not asking you to accept charity. We're asking you to let people who were moved by what you did return something. That's not charity. That's community. There's a difference, would you show us?" It was her own words. He'd kept them and handed them back to her. Emily took the envelope. Her hand was shaking badly now, and she stopped trying to hide it. "There's also something else," Jack said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were serious now. The grief tiredness replaced by something deliberate and careful. "About your manager, about Richard Hayes." Emily's chin came up slightly, the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned that trouble followed certain names. "What about him?" "I need to talk to you about some things Dex found, about what's been going on at that diner a lot longer than that $56. He glanced at Tyler, then back at her. And I need you to know before I say any of it that whatever comes next, you're not alone in it. Not anymore. Emily stood on her front porch in the cold morning air with 300 motorcycles at her back and an envelope in one hand and her son solid beside her, and she felt something give way inside her, very quietly, the way ice gives way in early spring. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in one slow, inevitable, irreversible shift. For 4 years, she had held every corner of her life by herself. For 4 years, she had done the math alone and lost sleep alone and driven home in the rain alone, and never not once let herself believe that help was a thing that would actually come. It had come. It had come on motorcycles on a Saturday morning, 300 strong, and it was standing at the bottom of her porch steps asking nothing in return except to let it. "Come inside," Emily said, and her voice was rough now, completely rough, no pretending otherwise. "I'll put on more coffee." Jack Mercer smiled for the first time she'd seen, and it changed his whole face. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but underneath it was something warm and solid and real. "Ma'am," he said, "I was hoping you'd say that." Jack Mercer sat at Emily's kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Mom" in faded letters, and he looked completely at home in a way that should have been strange, but somehow wasn't. Tyler had pulled up a third chair and was sitting slightly sideways the way teenagers sit when they're trying to look casual about something that has their full, undivided attention. 300 motorcycles were parked outside on their street. Emily's neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, had come out in her bathrobe to stare, then gone back inside, then come back out again with a second cup of coffee for herself, apparently deciding that whatever this was, it was worth watching. Emily set the coffee pot down on the table between them and sat across from Jack. The envelope was on the counter behind her. She hadn't opened it yet. She wasn't ready to open it yet because she knew that when she did, something would become real that she was still working up to. "Tell me about Richard Hayes," she said. Jack set down his mug. He looked at her steadily, the way a man looks at someone when he's decided they deserve the unedited version of something. "How much do you know already?" "I know he docks pay for things that aren't in the handbook," Emily said. "I know the tip pool numbers have never felt exactly right, and I know I've never been able to prove that because he's the only one who touches the spreadsheet. I know 4 people quit without collecting their last checks, and I always thought that was strange, but I told myself people move on and sometimes don't chase down $80 because it costs more in aggravation than it's worth." She paused. "I told myself a lot of things over 11 years because I needed the job." "That's what he counted on," Jack said, "with everybody." The words landed flat and simple in the kitchen, and Emily felt them settle somewhere in her chest in a way that was less like surprise and more like confirmation of something she'd kept deliberately vague for a very long time. "How bad is it?" Tyler asked. He was watching Jack with his father's directness, that same unsettling, calm clarity in his eyes. Jack glanced at him, then back at Emily, as if asking silently whether this conversation was appropriate for the boy in the room. Emily gave a small nod. Tyler was 17. Tyler had been handling adult weight since he was 13. He could hear this. "A man named Dex, he's someone I trust. With this kind of digging, he spent 48 hours talking to former employees and cross-referencing payroll records they still had copies of," Jack said. 4 people left without final checks. That's confirmed. 3 more had unauthorized deductions that ranged from $20 to over 100 documented nowhere. And the tip pool discrepancy, he stopped, exhaled slowly. Emily, the 2 former employees willing to talk on record, both said they remember consistently counting tips that ran about 15 to 20% higher than what ended up on the sheet Hayes controlled. Emily was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the muted sound of 300 people existing patiently on her street drifted through the walls. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Best anyone can tell, the whole 8 years he's been there." Emily did the math automatically, the way she always did her mind-running numbers before the rest of her had decided how to feel about them. Even a conservative estimate, even assuming the smallest discrepancies. 8 years, dozens of employees cycling through. The sum of it was staggering and small, at the same time staggering in total small. In the individual pieces, the exact size specifically calibrated to stay beneath the threshold where people would decide to fight rather than absorb. "He knew what he was doing," she said quietly. "He kept it small enough that no single person could justify the cost of fighting it. That's exactly right, Jack said. And it worked. Until now. Why now? Jack picked up his coffee mug again. Because now those people aren't alone anymore. And because I found an attorney willing to take this on contingency if the former employees will talk. A man named Paul Steger out of Billings. He's looked at what Dex put together and he says there's a case. Wage theft, potentially fraud. It's not a sure thing. Nothing in law is a sure thing, but it's solid ground to stand on. Tyler leaned forward. What does that mean for Mom? It means, Jack said, looking at Emily, that if you are willing to come forward as a current employee, the most recent victim, the one with the freshest documentation, it makes the whole case stronger. But it also means Richard Hayes may find out before it's resolved. It means the job you've worked for 11 years becomes uncertain. It means things get harder before they get better. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You deserve the whole picture. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11 years. 11 years of arriving 5 minutes early because that was who she was. 11 years of covering shifts, of staying late, of never once dipping into the tip pool out of turn, even on the nights when it would have made a difference. 11 years of Richard Hayes' small cruelties, his precisely calibrated humiliations, his policy-shaped thefts, she'd accepted one by one because the alternative had always felt more dangerous than the cost. She thought about Ruth slipping her 320s in the parking lot. She thought about 4 people who'd walked away from paychecks they were owed because fighting felt too expensive. She thought about the $56 receipt and what it had already cost her and what it had already returned, and the math of that was not the kind of math she was used to doing. I'm in, Emily said. Jack's shoulders visibly relaxed, an inch of tension releasing that she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. I was hoping that was where we'd land. I've got one condition, Emily said. Name it. The other employees, the former ones, the ones Dex talked to, if this goes forward and there's any recovery of back pay or damages, they get taken care of first, before me. Jack stared at her. Tyler stared at her. The refrigerator kept humming. Emily, Jack started. They walked away without their last checks. They left because they were afraid and because there was nobody backing them up. They suffered this longer than I did, most of them, and they've been carrying it since without anything to show for it. Her voice was level. They go first. That's my condition. A long silence. Then Jack said very quietly, Danny would have said the same thing, in exactly those words. Neither of them said anything after that for a moment. Then Tyler cleared his throat. Someone should probably go tell the 300 people outside what's happening. What happened next moved faster than Emily was prepared for, though she should have been because she'd seen by now how things moved when Jack Mercer decided they were moving. He stepped out onto her porch and she followed him. Tyler at her shoulder, and the street went quiet the way it had been quiet before that particular focused silence of people who've come a long way for a purpose and are waiting to understand it fully. Jack didn't make a speech. He wasn't a speech kind of man, Emily was learning. He said what needed saying in as few words as it took and trusted people to carry the meaning. She's in, he said. We go forward. Paul Steger's waiting for our call on Monday morning. The response from the street wasn't loud. It wasn't the roar Emily might have expected from 300 people gathered in one place. It was something quieter than that, a collective exhale, nods passing through the crowd like a wave, a few people reaching out to clap the shoulders of the people standing nearest to them. The language of people who communicate in gesture and proximity rather than volume. A woman Emily hadn't noticed before, mid-50s, close-cropped gray hair, standing near the front of the crowd with the particular stillness of someone comfortable, being exactly where she was caught Emily's eye, and held it for a moment, then gave a single slow nod. Emily didn't know who she was, but she nodded back because the moment seemed to require it. Later, she would find out the woman's name was Sandra Mercer. Jack's wife of 31 years, she'd driven 4 hours that morning without being asked. The crowd began to shift, not dispersing, but reorganizing, smaller clusters forming, people moving to their bikes or pulling out phones, the energy changing from waiting into doing. Jack's network. Emily was beginning to understand was not the kind of organization that needed instruction for every step. These were people who'd learned how to operate on trust and shared purpose across long distances, who knew how to take a direction and fill in the rest themselves. Marcus, the youngest of the original 5, the one with Danny's name on his arm, who Emily hadn't seen in the crowd until now, appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "I wanted to say something," he said, "when I was outside that diner, in the rain. What you said to me." "You don't have to," Emily started. "I do, actually." He said it without aggression, just firmly, the way people say things they've rehearsed because they know themselves well enough to know they'll lose the nerve otherwise. "You said to let it make you gentler instead of harder. I've been thinking about that every day since. Every single day." He swallowed. "Danny was the gentlest person I knew, and I've been so angry since he died that I forgot to be anything else. So I just wanted to say thank you for giving me something to try to be instead of angry." Emily came down the porch steps and hugged him, and Marcus went rigid with surprise for exactly 1 second before his arms came up and he hugged her back the way young men hug when they've been pretending not to need it for too long. Tyler, watching from the porch, had given up entirely on pretending not to be affected. He was looking at his phone with great intensity, which was the 17-year-old equivalent of wiping your face without making it obvious. The Monday morning call with Paul Steger lasted 45 minutes, and by the end of it, Emily's hand was cramped from taking notes on the back of an envelope because she'd run out of notepad paper somewhere around minute 20. Steger was direct, thorough, and spoke to Emily like someone who respected her intelligence and time, which after 8 years of Richard Hayes felt almost disorienting. "What we have is strong," he said. "What would make it stronger is documentation from you personally, any records you've kept of your own pay stubs, anything where you noticed a discrepancy and wrote it down." "I kept everything," Emily said. A pause. "Everything. 11 years of pay stubs, all my shift records, a notebook I started keeping about 3 years ago when the tip pool numbers stopped adding up. Dates, amounts, what I counted, what showed up on the sheet. I didn't know if it would ever matter, but I kept it." Another pause, longer this time. "Emily, that notebook may be the single most important piece of evidence in this case." She hadn't thought of it as evidence. She'd thought of it as insurance, or maybe just as the thing you do when you know something is wrong and you can't prove it yet, and the only power you have is to remember it accurately. "I've got it in a shoebox under my bed," she said. She heard Steger exhale through his teeth. "Get it out of the house. Today. Make copies. Give a copy to Jack and keep one somewhere that isn't your home in case Hayes finds out this is coming and tries anything. You think he would?" "I think men who've been running this kind of operation for 8 years have a survival instinct. I think we move fast and we keep things quiet until we're ready to be loud. Can you come to my office this week?" "I'm working Tuesday through Thursday," Emily said. "Friday." "Friday works. I'll need that notebook, the pay stubs, and any other documentation. And Emily keeps showing up to work normally. Don't change anything. Don't give him any reason to watch you more closely than he already does." Emily thought of Richard Hayes' small, precise handwriting at the bottom of her paycheck, the particular satisfaction in his face when he'd told her about the policy he'd invented on the spot. "I can do that," she said. She got off the phone and sat in the quiet of her kitchen for a moment, and then she went to her bedroom and pulled the shoebox out from under her bed and sat on the floor with it in her lap, lifting the lid and looking at 11 years of her own careful attention, the pay stubs organized by year, the rubber-banded stacks of shift records, the spiral notebook with its battered cover, and 67 pages of dates and numbers, and the precise patient notations of a woman who'd known for a long time that something was wrong and had needed for 11 years to wait for the right moment. The right moment had arrived on a rainy night in the form of 5 grieving men and a $56 bill. She made copies at the library. She gave one set to Jack, who drove 40 minutes to come and get it without complaining. She put the second set in a safety deposit box at the bank branch 2 miles from her house. She drove to work on Tuesday morning and tied on her apron and refilled coffee cups and smiled at customers and said yes, Mr. Hayes, and no, Mr. Hayes, and of course Mr. Hayes, and every moment of it felt like a different kind of strength than she'd ever practiced. Not the strength of endurance, which she knew well, but the strength of patience with a destination which was entirely new. Ruth figured it out by Wednesday. Not from anything Emily said, but from the way Emily moved slightly differently than before, with a kind of internal stillness that Ruth, who'd worked next to her for 9 years, noticed the way you notice a change in how someone breathes. She waited until Richard was in the office and the diner was briefly empty, then appeared at Emily's elbow with the coffee pot and said very quietly directly into the space beside Emily's ear, "Something's happening." "I can't tell you yet," Emily said, equally quiet. "Does it have to do with the bikers?" "I can't tell you yet, Ruth." A pause. Ruth refilled the sugar dispenser that didn't need refilling the way Emily herself had done the night of the 5 riders. "Then am I in trouble?" "No," Emily said. "You might be in something good eventually, but not yet." Ruth absorbed this without another word, the particular discretion of a woman who understood timing. She went back to the kitchen. Emily kept moving between tables. Richard came out of the office at 11:15, walked the floor with his ledger, and looked at nothing that was Emily with the particular studied indifference of a man trying not to appear interested. He was watching, though. Emily could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather turns. She smiled at table 4 and asked if they needed more coffee and said, "My pleasure," and went back behind the counter, and she thought 3 more days. Just 3 more days. The twist came on Thursday, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Emily was midway through the lunch rush when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She never had her phone on during a shift. It was one of her own rules, not Richard's, and the number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, a Billings area code she didn't have saved. She let it go to voice smell and finished serving table 7, and then stepped into the back hallway and played the message. It was a woman's voice, young, tentative, nervous, in the way people sound when they have been thinking about making a call for a long time and have finally committed to it and aren't sure they've made the right decision. "Hi, my name is Kayla Briggs. I used to work at the Blue Pine Diner about 3 years ago. I got a call from someone named Dex who said I might be able to help with something involving Richard Hayes. I hung up on him because I wasn't sure. But then I thought about it for 2 days, and I'm calling back, but I'm calling you instead because," a pause, a breath that shook slightly, "because I heard what you did for those men in the rain. And I thought if you were brave enough to do that, then maybe I can be brave enough to do this. So, I'm calling. Please call me back." Emily stood in the back hallway with her phone pressed against her chest and her eyes closed for exactly 4 seconds. Then she called back. Kayla Briggs was 26 years old and had worked at the Blue Pine for 8 months before Richard Hayes had found a reason to cut her hours to the point where she couldn't pay her electric bill, at which point she'd left without a formal resignation, which he'd then used as justification for withholding her final 2 weeks of pay. She consulted with 2 people she trusted about whether to fight it, and both had told her it wasn't worth the trouble for $400. She had kept her pay stubs. She had kept the text messages from Richard sent to her personal number because he'd never bothered with anything official in which he'd told her her hours were being cut because of attitude issues with no further specification. "I didn't think it was enough," Kayla said. Her voice had steadied now that she was past the beginning. $400. People said I'd spend more fighting it than I'd win back. "It's not $400, Emily said. "It's $400 times everyone he did it to. That's what makes it enough." Kayla was quiet for a moment. "Dex said there were others." "There are others. There's an attorney. There's a case already building." Emily paused. "Can you get to Billings on Friday?" "I work Friday mornings." "So do I," Emily said. "We'll make it work." When she got off the phone, she was shaking. Not from fear this time. From the particular electric quality of momentum, of something that has been building, gathering speed, the feeling of watching scattered pieces suddenly understand they belong to the same picture. She called Jack from the parking lot on her lunch break, words coming fast, and he listened to everything without interrupting. And when she finished, he said, "That's the 4th one." "What?" "Dex reached 2 people willing to talk. You make 3. Kayla makes 4. Paul told me this morning he got a call from someone else, a man who worked there about 5 years ago, who said he'd heard through someone that something was happening at the diner and he wanted to be part of it." Jack's voice carried something underneath the steadiness, something that sounded, if Emily was reading it right, like the same electricity she was feeling. "It's spreading, Emily. Word is moving." "Through your network?" Emily asked. "Partly, but not entirely. These people aren't all connected to us. Some of them just heard the story about the waitress and the receipt, and it made them feel like the world might be different than they thought it was. And that feeling made them willing to try something they'd given up on." He paused. "You started something bigger than a legal case." Emily leaned against the side of the diner, the same building she'd walked into 11 years ago, and told herself she'd work for a year just to get back on her feet, just for a while. The check engine light on the Corolla across the lot caught the afternoon sun, and she made herself look at it directly the way you look at difficult things when you're done pretending they aren't there. "Jack," she said, "my car needs work. The rattle in the belt has gotten worse this week. I don't know how much longer it has." "Already handled," he said immediately. "What?" "There are 11 professional mechanics in the regional network. 3 of them have already volunteered their labor. Parts we can cover from the fund. We'll get it up to sound this weekend if you can spare it for a day. You can't just—" "Emily," his voice was patient, firm, warm. "Let people help you. You said to your son, it's okay. Say it to yourself." A long pause. Traffic on the highway, the wind moving through the trees at the edge of the parking lot, the distant sound of Ruth clattering something in the kitchen. "It's okay, Emily said, quietly, to herself mostly. "That's right," Jack said. "That's exactly right." Friday arrived with the particular charged quality of days that hold several things at once. Emily drove to Billings in the morning with her shoebox on the passenger seat and the copy of the notebook tucked inside it. Kayla Briggs meeting her in the parking lot of Paul Steger's building with a manila envelope of her own documents clutched in both hands, a young woman who looked like she'd barely slept and was carrying herself anyway because she'd made a decision and was committed to it. They looked at each other in the parking lot for a moment, 2 women who'd never met, who had only a diner and a man's cruelty and a $56 receipt in common, and Emily stuck out her hand. "Emily Carter." Kayla Briggs, a firm grip despite the shakiness in her eyes. "I'm glad you called back. I'm glad you called in the first place." They went in together. Paul Steger was exactly what his phone voice had suggested. Lean, no-nonsense in office that contained 4 boxes of files and a dyeing plant he appeared not to notice. He shook both their hands and got immediately to business, and for the next 2 hours, Emily watched the pieces of 11 years assemble themselves on a conference table into something that was— she finally allowed herself to think the word a case. The 5th former employee arrived at 10:30, a man named Dale Hutchins, who'd worked the kitchen for 3 years and left after Richard had docked his pay twice in 1 month for equipment damage Dale could prove he hadn't caused. He was 51, broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, and sat down across from Emily and said, "You're the one who tore up the check for the bikers." "I am," Emily said. Dale nodded slowly, looking at his hands. "My daughter told me about it. She saw it on some Facebook group or something. Somebody posted about it. She called me and said, 'Dad, this woman at the diner you used to work at did this thing,' and she told me the story." He paused. "I called Dex the same night." Emily absorbed this. The story she'd thought was between herself and 5 men in a diner had traveled through a Facebook group she'd never seen to a man she'd never met and brought him to a table where it might actually change something. She didn't know what to do with that fact, so she set it aside for later and focused on what was in front of her. Steger walked them all through the process, the timeline, what documentation strengthened the case and what was circumstantial, the realistic range of outcomes, the possibility of retaliation and what that would look like legally. He asked each of them questions with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that the details that seem small are almost always the ones that matter in the end. At 12:30, he closed his folder, looked at the 4 of them and said, "I'm filing the initial complaint with the Department of Labor next week. This is enough to move on. It'll be slow. These things are always slower than anyone wants, but I believe in this case and I'm going to work it until it's done." "What about Richard Hayes?" Kayla asked. "When does he find out?" "He'll be notified when the complaint is filed. At that point, yes, things at the diner become complicated for anyone still working there." He looked at Emily directly. "I understand," Emily said. "I want you to know that retaliation against an employee for participating in a wage theft complaint is itself illegal. If he acts against you in any way after the filing document, it immediately and contact me that same day." "She won't be alone in it," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone looked up. Jack Mercer stood in the doorway of the conference room. Emily hadn't even heard him come in, still in his vest, holding a paper cup of coffee from the lobby, looking at Richard Hayes' remaining victim at his conference table, with an expression that was equal parts protectiveness and something harder and more permanent underneath it. Emily hadn't known he was coming. She looked at him with surprise she didn't try to hide. "Thought you might want a friendly face in the room," he said simply. Steger looked at Jack with the expression of a man who had learned in his career not to be surprised by the range of people that walked into his office. "You're Jack Mercer." "I am. Your network has been helpful," Steger said, which Emily suspected was lawyer understatement for something more significant. "Please sit down." Jack sat. He didn't say much else during the meeting. He wasn't there to talk, he was there to be present, which Emily was learning was a different and sometimes more powerful thing. But when they finally walked out of Steger's building at 1:45 in the afternoon into a clear, cold April day, Emily turned to Jack and said, "You drove all the way from Billings." "I was already in Billings," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when he was choosing words carefully. "Because I needed to be somewhere that mattered today," he said. "After everything with Danny, I needed to be part of something that was going in the right direction for once." Emily understood that completely. She understood it in her bones. They stood together in the parking lot while Kayla and Dale exchanged numbers beside their respective cars, a new connection forming in the ordinary way. New connections form tentatively, awkwardly, hopefully, people who have been through something together trying on the idea of remaining in contact afterward. "What happens now?" Emily asked Jack. "Now Steger files. Now you keep going to work and doing your job and letting nothing show. Now the people in my network who have been fixing your car all day finish fixing your car." He glanced at his phone. "Jimmy says they found 3 things wrong beyond the belt and they're handling all of it. You'll get it back tomorrow afternoon and it should run like it did the day you drove it off the lot." Emily laughed at that, short and startled. "That car hasn't run that well in 6 years. "Good time to start then," Jack said. He looked at her sideways, and something in his face shifted toward the open, unguarded quality she'd seen at her kitchen table. "Tyler's deposit, it's covered. Community took care of it the morning we showed up at your house. It's already in that envelope. Don't argue with me about it." Emily pressed her lips together. She'd been telling herself she'd give that envelope back. She'd been telling herself that for 4 days every time she thought about it, sitting on her kitchen counter. "It's too much," she said. "It's 350 people splitting $500, Jack said. "That's $1 and change per person. Don't make it bigger than it is." "It's enormous," Emily said, and her voice went rough again, that same roughness that had been ambushing her all week at inconvenient moments. "It's enormous to me, Jack," he nodded. "I know," he said simply. "That's why we did it." Tyler's spot at Bridger Technical College was secured. Emily's car was being put back together by 11 men who didn't know her and didn't need to. Paul Steger had a shoebox of evidence on his conference room table and 4 people willing to stand behind it. Richard Hayes didn't know any of this yet. He was at this exact moment sitting in his small office at the Blue Pine Diner, drinking bad coffee and making small marks in his ledger, completely unaware that the ground under everything he'd built on other people's silence was already shifting, had been shifting for a week, had been set in motion by a woman with an empty bank account and a rainy night and a decision that cost her $56 and was about to return something that couldn't be counted. Ruth was on the floor covering Emily's section, humming something low under her breath. She'd been humming all week. Ruth had the particular humming of a woman who suspected something was coming and had decided to be patient about knowing what it was. She was almost right. She was a week away from knowing exactly what it was. And when she found out, she would put down the coffee pot in the middle of the lunch rush and cover her mouth with both hands and stand that way for a full 30 seconds before she pulled herself together and went back to work. But that was still a week away. Right now, Emily Carter stood in a parking lot in Billings in the April cold with her documentation filed and her attorney retained and her car being healed and her son's future one step more secured and the knowledge solid and new and still slightly astonishing that she was not alone in any of it. She breathed in the cold air slowly. Let it out. The math, for the first time in a very long time, was starting to add up differently. The complaint landed on a Tuesday. Emily knew it had been filed because Paul Steger called her at 7:48 in the morning before her shift while she was standing in the kitchen watching Tyler eat cereal and pretend he wasn't nervous about his first day of a weekend apprenticeship at a garage in town that one of Jack's mechanics had arranged for him. "It's in," Steger said. "Department of Labor received it this morning. Hayes will be notified within the week, possibly sooner. Are you ready?" Emily thought about that word. Ready. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over something you found on the ground, examining it from different angles before deciding what it is. Was she ready? She had a car that ran properly for the first time in 6 years. She had Tyler's deposit secured. She had 67 pages of careful notes in Paul Steger's filing cabinet. She had Jack Mercer's number saved in her phone and 300 people who had shown up on her street on a Saturday morning and asked nothing in return. Yes, she said, I'm ready. She drove to work. She tied on her apron. She smiled at the couple in booth 2 and refilled the coffee at the counter and said good morning to Richard Hayes when he came through the back door at 8:15 with his ledger under his arm, and he said good morning back without looking at her, which was normal because Richard Hayes almost never looked directly at the people who worked for him unless he was about to do something to them. She went about her day. She went about the next day and the day after that. On Thursday, she was refilling the napkin dispensers at the end of the lunch rush when she heard Richard's voice change in the back office. Not words, just register the particular sharp rise of a voice receiving unexpected information, a single clipped syllable that could have been a name or a curse followed by a silence so complete that Ruth looked up from the pie case and caught Emily's eye and held it. Emily went back to the napkin dispensers. Her hands were steady. She was slightly amazed that her hands were steady. 15 minutes later, Richard came out of the office. He walked the floor the way he always did, ledger tucked, scowl in place. But there was something different in the set of his jaw. Tighter, the muscle jumping slightly at the hinge, and his eyes moved across the diner with a new quality, a scanning quality, like a man who suddenly doesn't know where the threat is coming from and is trying to locate it. His eyes landed on Emily. She was at the counter. She looked up, met his gaze, and said, Afternoon rush is going to be light today. There's a high school event pulling people to the east side of town. Richard stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, fine, and went back to his office. Ruth appeared at Emily's elbow the moment the office door closed. What was that? What was what? Emily said. Ruth gave her a look of extreme patience. Emily, just a little longer, Emily said quietly, not looking at her. A few more days, I promise. Ruth studied her sideways for a moment, then straightened up and went back to the kitchen, moving with the kind of deliberate normalcy that told Emily she understood at least enough to play along. The afternoon crawled. Emily kept moving, kept smiling, kept her hands busy because busy hands were the only thing keeping her brain from running ahead to all the possible ways this could go wrong. She thought about Steger's voice retaliation against an employee for participating in a wage theft complaint is itself illegal. She thought about it like a mantra, not because she was afraid exactly, but because she was a practical woman and practical women prepared for probable outcomes. By 5 o'clock, Richard hadn't said another word to her. He left at 5:30, 20 minutes earlier than usual without giving a reason, without looking at anyone directly. Emily called Jack from the parking lot at 5:45. He knows, she said. You sure? Something changed in him today around noon. He got a phone call and came out of his office different. He's known since today. How are you? Jack asked. Steady, Emily said and meant it. Strange that I'm steady, but I am. Not strange, Jack said. You've been running on fear for 11 years. Fear of losing the job, fear of the Gap clothing if you push back, fear of being alone in it. You're not running on fear anymore. That's why you're steady. Emily stood in the parking lot and let that land. It landed true. Paul needs to know he's been notified, she said. Call him now. I'll stay on standby tonight. She called Steger from the car before she pulled out of the lot. He listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said, document everything from this point forward. Every interaction, every change in his behavior, date, and time. If he says anything to you directly about the complaint, do not engage beyond saying you have legal representation. Give me his name. My number is now your first call if anything happens. Already have it memorized, Emily said. She drove home and made dinner and ate with Tyler, who was full of talk about the apprenticeship garage, about a differential rebuild he'd been allowed to observe that afternoon, about a mechanic named Lou, who had 30 years of experience and had let Tyler hand him tools and explained each one before he used it. His eyes were bright in a way she hadn't seen in months, the specific brightness of someone who has touched the future they're trying to build and found it solid. She listened to every word. She asked questions. She laughed at the right moments. And later, when he was in his room and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and wrote down the date, the time, the change in Richard's voice, the scanning quality of his eyes, the 20-minute early departure, every detail precise and specific, the same patient notation she'd been making for 3 years now, with a new weight behind it, now feeding forward into something. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment. 11 years of arriving early and staying late and absorbing small cruelties and telling herself the job was worth it. 11 years of the math never quite adding up and the gap never quite closing, and the impossible arithmetic of a single mother who needed the work too much to fight for the dignity. One rainy night, 5 men, $56. She put the notebook away and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she fell asleep without running numbers in her head. Friday brought the first piece of retaliation, and it came so precisely in the form Steger had predicted that Emily almost felt a dark, exhausted admiration for its predictability. She arrived at 7 a.m. to find her schedule for the following 2 weeks had been posted. Richard always posted 2 weeks out under normal circumstances, a fact she'd noted carefully in the notebook, and her hours had been cut. Not eliminated, not a formal action that could be immediately challenged, but cut. 39 hours to 22. The shifts that remained were the least desirable, the slowest, the ones with the smallest tip pools. The prime lunch and dinner shifts, the ones she'd worked consistently for 6 years, were redistributed to 2 part-time employees who had been hired in January and had seniority over no one. Ruth saw the schedule at the same moment Emily did, both of them standing at the posting board inside the back door, and Ruth's jaw set in a way Emily had seen maybe twice before in 9 years, a specific rigid fury that Ruth generally kept well controlled. "Don't," Emily said quietly. "Emily, don't say anything to him, not yet, I mean it, Ruth." She looked at her directly. "Please, a few more days." Ruth breathed in through her nose, slow and deliberate, the controlled breath of someone choosing not to say several things. "Fine," she said finally, "but I want it on record that I have opinions." "Your opinions are noted and appreciated," Emily said. "Can you cover booth 4? It just filled up." She texted Steger the schedule change before she even reached booth 4. His response came back in under 4 minutes. "Perfect. Exactly what we needed. Do not react to Hayes about this. Document in hold." She documented and held. The shift was slow. The way Thursday afternoon shifts in a diner always are, the dead quiet between the last lunch customer and the first dinner arrival, that specific lull where the restaurant breathes and the waitstaff refills everything that doesn't need refilling. Emily cleaned the coffee machine. She restocked the straw dispensers. She straightened the placement of every ketchup bottle on every table with a precision that had nothing to do with ketchup and everything to do with giving her hands something to do while her brain held steady. Richard came out of the office at 2 o'clock. He stood at the counter. He poured himself a coffee. He looked at Emily with the particular studied casualness of a man attempting something he isn't naturally suited for. "Slow today," he said. "Always is on Fridays," Emily said. Same tone she always used, same slight smile. "How are things going for you?" Richard asked. "Generally." Emily looked at him. She'd worked for this man for 11 years. She knew every register of his voice, every tell, every way he adjusted his delivery when he was running a strategy versus when he was simply talking. This was strategy. This was a man who had received a Department of Labor complaint and was now trying to take the temperature of who had filed it without asking directly, which would expose that he knew. "Fine," Emily said. "Steady, thank you for asking." His eyes moved over her face, looking for something she wasn't giving him. She looked back, pleasant, open, empty, of anything he could use. "Good," he said finally. "Good to hear." And he went back to the office. Emily counted to 10 before she allowed herself to exhale. She called Jack on her break. "He tried to fish," she told him. "Asked me how things were going. Tried to make it casual." "What did you give him?" "Nothing." "Good." A pause. "Emily, I need to tell you something." The quality of his voice shifted, and she felt it immediately, the way you feel a shift in the weight of the air before weather turns. "What?" "One of the former employees, Dale Hutchins, he got a call this morning from someone who said they were doing a reference check for a job Dale applied for 2 months ago. Except Dale didn't apply for any jobs 2 months ago." Emily was quiet. Whoever called had specific information about why Dale left the Blue Pine, information that would only be available from internal records. The call was designed to sound like a reference check, but it was really meant to intimidate, to signal to Dale that Hayes knows who's talking and has access to his employment history. Can he do that? Emily asked. Legally. He just did it. Whether he can do it legally is exactly what Steger is dealing with right now. He's already on it. But Emily, Jack paused, I needed you to know because it means Hayes is running scared, and when scared men run, they don't always think about what lines they're crossing. Steger thinks the timeline needs to accelerate. He's requesting an expedited review. What does that mean practically? It means this moves faster. It means more pressure on Hayes in a shorter window. And it means he stopped. Jack, what does it mean? It means there's a chance Richard Hayes tries to terminate you before the review is complete to muddy the waters and make your testimony look retaliatory. Steger says that move would actually backfire legally. It would be the strongest possible evidence of guilt, but it doesn't mean Hayes won't try it anyway if he panics. Emily stood in the back hallway with her phone pressed to her ear and her back against the wall, and she thought about 22 hours a week in Thursday afternoon shifts, and a man who had just called Dale Hutchins pretending to be a reference checker, and she thought about the specific cold calculation of someone who believed he could still win this by intimidating the people around the edges of it. She thought about 11 years. She thought about 67 pages. She thought about 4 people walking away from paychecks they were owed because nobody was standing beside them. Let him try, Emily said, a beat of silence on Jack's end. Then you sure? If he terminates me, Steger said, it's the strongest evidence. So let him make that choice. I'm not going to make it easy for him by flinching, and I'm not going to make it hard for him by doing anything other than my job. Her voice was even. He can't take anything from me that I haven't already survived losing. And this time I'm not alone. Jack was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had that particular thickness she'd heard only once before the night of the funeral, the night of the rain. You know what Danny would have said about you? What? He would have said you're the bravest person he never got to meet. A pause. I agree with him. Emily pressed her lips together, said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. Went back to work. The call from Steger came on the following Wednesday at noon, and it was not the call Emily had been bracing for. It was not a call about termination or further retaliation or a complication in the filing. It was something she hadn't expected at all, and when she listened to his voicemail standing in the diner parking lot on her lunch break, she had to play it twice to be sure she'd heard it correctly. Emily, Paul Steger, I need you to call me back as soon as you can. We've had a development. The Department of Labor investigator assigned to your case made a preliminary contact with the diner's parent company, this morning the ownership group above Hayes, and it turns out they've had their own concerns about him for over a year. They'd been building a quiet internal case because they suspected discrepancies in the financial reporting, but they didn't have employee testimony. Now they do. The ownership group has requested a meeting. This is moving faster than I anticipated. Call me. Emily called him back immediately, still standing in the parking lot, her lunch uneaten in her jacket pocket. Tell me everything, she said. The parent company was a small hospitality group out of Billings that owned 4 properties in Montana, of which the Blue Pine was the least profitable, by a margin that had apparently been puzzling them for 18 months. They'd run their own quiet numbers and found that the diner's performance didn't match what it should have been generating, given its traffic and overhead. The gap between what it should have been earning and what it was reporting had been attributed to a range of explanations Hayes had offered over the years. Increased food costs, slow seasons customer trends, all of which were plausible individually and suspicious in aggregate. The Department of Labor inquiry had landed on the ownership group's desk like a key in a lock that had been waiting for it. They want to meet with you, Steger said. With you specifically. They have asked to speak with the current employee who filed. They want to understand what's been happening on the ground. When, Emily asked. They've offered Friday. Their office is in Billings. Second Friday in a row in Billings. Emily thought about her schedule 22 hours a week now. Nothing on Friday or Richard's own manipulation creating the opening he hadn't intended to create. I'll be there, she said. Emily, I want to prepare you for what this meeting means. If the ownership group moves against Hayes independently, which is within their authority as his employer, this could resolve faster than a Department of Labor investigation would typically allow. We're talking weeks instead of months. Faster is better, Emily said. Faster is better, Steger agreed. But I want you to go into Friday clear-eyed. These are business people protecting their business. They want Hayes gone because he's been costing them money. The employee welfare piece matters to them because it matters to the case, not because they've been lying awake worrying about it. I want you in that room knowing the difference between an ally and a coincidence of interest. Emily appreciated that. It was honest in a way that helped her stand on solid ground rather than ground that felt better than it was. I understand the difference, she said. I'll take the help either way. That's the right answer, Steger said. I'll see you Friday. She called Jack next. He picked up on the second ring the way he always did and listened without interrupting while she laid out everything Steger had said. And when she finished, he was quiet for a beat that she'd learned to read as him processing rather than hesitating. The ownership group, he said finally. You know something about them. I know that the man who owns the hospitality group, his name is Frank Dalton. I know that he built his business on the principle that his properties run clean. He said it publicly multiple times. He doesn't like being made a fool of, and he especially doesn't like finding out that someone under him has been making him a fool for years without him catching it. A pause. If Frank Dalton is in that room on Friday, Emily, he's not just there to fix a problem. He's there because this became personal to him. Is that good or bad? Depends entirely on whether he respects you. Another pause. He will, Jack said. Tell him the truth the way you told it to me. He'll respect you. She walked into Frank Dalton's office on Friday with Paul Steger beside her, in the specific calm of someone who has already survived the hardest part and is now simply walking the last mile of it. Frank Dalton was 63, white-haired, the kind of man whose handshake tells you everything about how he was raised, firm, direct, looking you in the eyes for the full duration of it. He had two other people in the room with him, an HR director and a woman who was introduced as the company's internal legal counsel, and the four of them sat around a table that was considerably less chaotic than Paul Steger's conference table, which Emily noticed with a small private amusement. Ms. Carter, Frank Dalton said, thank you for coming. Thank you for asking, Emily said. I want to start by saying something before we get into the specifics. Dalton leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table, the posture of a man who does not use distance as a tool. I have been in this business for 31 years. I built it from one property on nothing but labor and the principle that the people who work for me are treated fairly. Not generously necessarily, not always perfectly, but fairly. That's the foundation. Everything else is built on that. He paused. I am deeply ashamed that what has apparently been happening in Laurel has been happening under my name for 8 years without my knowledge. I want to fix it. I want to fix all of it. And I need your help to understand exactly what fixing it requires. Emily looked at him for a moment. She thought about what Steger had said, coincidence of interest versus genuine ally, and she thought that Frank Dalton might be both, which was not the worst kind of person to have across a table from you. Then let's talk, she said. She talked for 2 hours. She answered every question directly and completely consulting her notes when the specifics required it, and she did not minimize or dramatize or editorialize. She spoke about the tip pool the way she had in the notebook. Dates, amounts, discrepancies, patterns. She spoke about the unauthorized deductions, Richard's invented policies, the schedule. Schedule manipulation, the climate of low-grade intimidation that had kept employees from pushing back for years. She spoke about the 4 people who'd walked away from paychecks they were owed, about Caleb Briggs's $400, about Dale Hutchins' docked pay for damage he hadn't caused. Dalton's legal counsel took notes throughout. His HR director's expression moved through a range of things she was mostly but not entirely successful at keeping professional. Dalton himself listened with a stillness that reminded Emily oddly of Jack. The same quality of someone who has learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is receive it fully before you respond to it. When Emily finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Dalton said, "The man who tore your receipt up and docked you $56. Yes, Emily said. The same man who cut your hours after the complaint was filed. Yes. And the same man who called Dale Hutchins under false pretenses after receiving notice of the investigation. That's what we understand, yes." Dalton nodded once slowly. He looked at his legal counsel, who gave a small nod in return. He looked at his HR director, who looked at her notepad and then back at him. Then he looked at Emily. "Richard Hayes is suspended as of this afternoon, pending the conclusion of both the Department of Labor review and our own internal investigation," he said. He will not return to that building. If what you've described is substantiated, and I believe it will be, his employment will be terminated, and we will cooperate fully with whatever legal process follows." He paused. "I also want to discuss what we owe the employees who were affected. All of them. I want the numbers, and I want to make them right." Emily held very still. "And Miss Carter," Dalton said, and his voice shifted into something that was quieter and she thought more personal than the rest of the conversation had been. "Your job is secure. Your hours will be restored to what they were before the schedule change. And we will be looking closely at what your compensation has been over 11 years against what the records suggest it should have been." Stigger beside her said nothing, but she felt him exhale. "There's one thing I want to be clear about," Emily said. Dalton waited. "The other employees, the former ones, Caleb Briggsdale Hutchins, the others' decks found the 4 people who left without their final checks. They go first. Whatever process of making this right looks like they are the priority, not me." Dalton looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way of a man who has seen many people in many difficult situations and has learned not to show in his face what he thinks of each one. Then he said, "Steger told me you'd say that." Emily blinked. "He did." Steger beside her was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man attempting to appear innocent. "He told me that before any meeting happened, he expected you to make exactly that condition," Dalton said, "and that it was the condition of someone he trusted." He glanced at his legal counsel, who slid a folder across the table toward Emily. "The plan we've drafted for restitution already prioritizes former employees, because that's how you fix something correctly." Emily looked at the folder. She didn't open it yet. She looked at Frank Dalton and Paul Steger and the HR director and the legal counsel all sitting in this room on a Friday afternoon in Billings, all moving pieces of something she had started with a torn receipt on a rainy night in Montana, and she felt the full strangeness and weight of it settle over her like something physical. "Okay," she said quietly, "then let's fix it correctly." Outside in the hallway afterward, while the legal details were being finalized with Steger inside, Emily sat in one of the waiting chairs and called Jack. He picked up first ring this time. "Well," he said, "Hayes is suspended as of today. Permanent termination pending investigation. All employees being made whole. My job secure with hours restored." She paused. "Former employees prioritized." A long silence on Jack's end, long enough that Emily looked at her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Jack." "Yeah," his voice was rough. "Yeah, I'm here." Another pause. "Danny's daughter turns 5 next month. His wife Sarah has been carrying everything alone since the accident, same way you were. I've been trying to figure out how to help without making her feel like charity," Emily said softly. "Like charity." He cleared his throat. "You said let it make you gentler instead of harder." "I did." "I'm working on it," he said, and still working on it. "Me too," Emily said. "That's all we can do. Just keep working on it." She sat in that hallway chair for another moment after they hung up alone in the particular quiet that follows the completion of something enormous, before the next thing begins, and the weight redistributes and life continues its motion forward. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone in a distant office laughed at something. A phone rang and was answered. She thought about Tyler at the apprenticeship garage, hands on a differential rebuild, learning the shape of the future he was building. She thought about Caleb Briggs, who had called because a story about a torn receipt made her feel like the world might be different than she'd thought. She thought about Danny Osgood's little girl who would turn 5 next month and didn't yet understand why her father wasn't there for it. She thought about Jack at 58, still working on gentleness, still choosing it deliberately every day. She thought about Ruth, who was right now back at the Blue Pine Diner, covering Emily's section for the 2nd Friday in a row, humming to herself, patient, loyal waiting, without being told to wait. Emily stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up her purse. She had a 2-hour drive back to Laurel, and she needed to stop at the grocery store because Tyler was out of cereal, and she'd promised him soup this week and hadn't made it yet. And there were ordinary, specific daily things waiting for her on the other side of this moment. The kind of ordinary things that were the whole point of all of it. She walked out of Frank Dalton's building into the April afternoon, and the air was cold and clean, and her car, her fixed running, properly, no rattle, all 3. Things Wrong Now corrected car was in the parking lot waiting for her, and she got in and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before she started the engine. Then she started it. It ran like a car that had been put right by people who cared whether it ran correctly. She pulled out of the lot and pointed herself toward home, and she drove. Ruth found out on a Monday. Emily had planned to tell her privately before the shift started in the back hallway, where they'd had 100 quiet conversations over 9 years that the rest of the diner never heard. She'd planned to sit Ruth down with a coffee and walk through it carefully, give her the full picture in the right order, so it made sense, so the pieces landed the way they were supposed to. That was the plan. What actually happened was that Frank Dalton's HR director, a precise and efficient woman named Carol Marsh, called the diner at 8:47 in the morning to inform whoever answered that Richard Hayes would not be returning to the property, that interim management would be arranged by end of week, and that all employees should direct questions to the ownership group directly. Ruth answered the phone. Emily was still in the parking lot, still getting out of her car, still thinking about the careful conversation she was going to have when Ruth appeared at the back door of the diner with the phone still in her hand and an expression on her face that Emily had never seen in 9 years of standing next to this woman. Not anger, not shock, but something that was both of those things and underneath them, something that looked almost like the specific delayed exhale of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally been told they can stop. Carol Marsh, Ruth said, holding up the phone. Ruth, Carol Marsh from Dalton Hospitality, just told me Richard Hayes has been suspended pending termination and that employees with questions should call the ownership group directly. Ruth's voice was completely level in the way of a woman making enormous internal efforts. Was this you? It was a lot of people, Emily said, but it started with me, yes. Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment. Her chin moved slightly, the almost invisible movement of someone locking down a strong feeling. Then she put the phone down on the shelf inside the door and walked directly to Emily and hugged her hard, both arms all the way around, the kind of hug that communicates things that words aren't sufficient for. And Emily hugged her back just as hard, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything adequate to say. When Ruth pulled back, her eyes were bright, but her jaw was set. How long have you known? She asked. About 3 weeks. Ruth absorbed this. You were protecting me, keeping me out of it in case it went wrong. Partly, Emily admitted, and partly because you'd have done something that got you fired before we could finish building the case. Ruth considered this with the honest self-awareness of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of when pushed far enough. That's probably true, she said. Okay, tell me everything. You've got 40 minutes before the breakfast rush. So Emily told her everything right there in the back hallway in 40 minutes. Standing up, and Ruth listened without interrupting except twice once when Emily described the 67 pages of notebook documentation, at which point Ruth said simply and fiercely, "Good girl," and once when Emily described Dale Hutchins driving to Billings for the meeting, at which point Ruth pressed her lips together and stared at the ceiling for 3 seconds before collecting herself. When Emily finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The tip pool, I always knew. I always thought I knew, but I told myself I was being suspicious. I talked myself out of it every time because I needed to believe I was wrong more than I needed to believe I was right." I know, Emily said. I did the same thing. How much did he take from us over the years? All of us. Steger's still working on the full number. It's significant. Ruth was quiet again. The refrigerator hummed. The first car of the morning pulled into the parking lot outside. In 40 minutes, the diner would fill, and the routine would reassert itself the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened or was happening in the people working inside it. The bikers, Ruth said. Yes. 5 men came in from the rain and you fed them and everything changed. Yes. Ruth shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the particular wonder of someone seeing the full shape of something they'd only had pieces of before. Emily Ann Carter, she said, you are something else entirely. Emily laughed short and startled, and it broke something that had been held tight in her chest for 3 weeks, and the two of them stood there in the back hallway of the Blue Pine Diner, laughing together in a way that wasn't entirely about anything funny, the way people laugh when relief and exhaustion and the absurdity of how things actually work finally find each other in the same moment. Then Ruth straightened up, pulled her apron off its hook, and said, now we have a breakfast rush to run. And I want it noted that I am going to be extremely professional about the fact that we are apparently now operating without a manager, and I am not going to say anything uncharitable about that, even though I have many uncharitable things available. Noted, Emily said, and they went to work. The investigation took 4 weeks. In those 4 weeks, the interim manager, Frank Dalton, assigned to the Blue Pine, was a quiet, methodical woman named Joan Pressler, who had worked for the ownership group for 12 years and ran a clean ship in the particular way of people who have seen what happens when someone doesn't. She arrived on her first day, introduced herself to every person on the floor, asked Ruth what she needed that she hadn't been getting, and then got out of the way and let the diner run. Emily worked her restored hours. She worked them the same way she'd always worked them, arriving early, staying until the work was done, treating every table the same way, whether it was a solo trucker at the counter or a family of 6 in the corner booth. The only difference was an absence where Richard Hayes had been, and that absence, Emily discovered, had a texture to it, a lightness, a lowered specific gravity, the way a room changes when something heavy has been removed from it, and you don't realize how heavy it was until it's gone. The breakfast crowd noticed in the way regulars notice things without always naming them. A man named George, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday for 22 years and always sat in the same counter seat, told Emily on his second visit after Hayes' suspension, "Something's different in here." "Interim management," Emily said. "New arrangement." George stirred his coffee. "No," he said. "It's something else. It's looser, like when you've had a tight shoe on all day and you take it off." He looked at her sideways. "You had something to do with that." "I work here, George," Emily said. "That's not a no," George said, and went back to his eggs. Ruth snorted softly behind the pie case. The former employees received their initial outreach from Steger's office in the second week. Certified letters, specific and clear, laying out what the investigation had found, what was owed, what the process of restitution would look like, and on what timeline. Kayla Briggs called Emily the evening she received hers, and Emily heard in her voice something she recognized, because she'd felt it herself, the complicated, destabilizing feeling of being told you were right about something you'd spent years convincing yourself you might be wrong about. $417, Kayla said. "That's what they're saying he took from me, plus the back tips. The total is..." She stopped. "It's more than I thought. I didn't know about the tips because I'd already talked myself into believing the tip pool was just lower than I expected." "He counted on that," Emily said. "He counted on us being reasonable, on us explaining away the discrepancy before we ever had a chance to question it." "I want to be angry," Kayla said. "I am angry, but I also feel..." She paused, searching for the word. "Seen. Does that sound strange? Like all those months of knowing something was wrong and not being able to prove it, and now someone has proved it, and I feel..." "Seen," Emily said. "No, that doesn't sound strange at all." Dale Hutchins called the next day. He was quieter about it than Kayla, the way Dale was quiet about most things, but there was something in his voice that had shifted since the meeting in Billings, a reduction in a weight that Emily had noticed him carrying even in the brief hours she'd spent in his company. "My wife wants to know if she can send you something," Dale said. "She doesn't need to do that," Emily said. "She's going to anyway," Dale said. "I'm just calling to warn you." 3 days later, a card arrived at the diner addressed to Emily Carter with a return address in Billings. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Grace Hutchins that Emily read standing at the counter and then folded carefully and put in her apron pocket and carried for the rest of the day. It said, "My husband stopped sleep right when he left that job. 3 years later, he still wasn't sleeping right. The night he came home from Billings, he slept 8 hours for the first time since I can remember. I don't know how to thank a stranger for giving my husband his sleep back, but I'm trying. Thank you, Emily Carter. You started something when you tore up that check. I hope you know that." Emily knew. She was learning slowly the full shape of what she'd started. It was larger than she'd understood it to be when she'd stood in that diner on a rainy night, making a decision she'd thought would matter to 5 people. It was larger and stranger and more interconnected than anything she could have mapped in advance. The way kindness always is when it actually travels, when it doesn't stay contained to the moment it was made in, but moves outward through the people it touches, changing the quality of small daily things in ways that can't be measured in any ledger. She thought about this a lot in those 4 weeks. She thought about it while she was working, while she was driving, while she sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with Tyler, who was spending every spare hour either at the apprenticeship garage or studying the Bridger Technical College curriculum he'd downloaded and was already reading ahead in. She thought about the specific chain of it. 5 men in the rain, a torn receipt. Jack's message sent from the shoulder of a dark highway. 300 motorcycles on a Saturday morning. Kayla's phone call. Dale's card. Grace Hutchins' husband sleeping 8 hours for the first time in 3 years. She thought about how none of it would have happened if she'd done the reasonable thing. If she'd looked at the bill and looked at her bank account and looked at the wow and chosen as anyone would have understood her choosing not to close it with her own money she didn't have. If she'd simply said, "I'm sorry, I can't do anything about what you owe," and handed them the check and let them work it out. The reasonable thing would have cost her nothing. It also would have started nothing. She thought about that a lot. The twist that arrived in the third week of the investigation was the one nobody had seen coming. Not Steger, not Jack, not Frank Dalton, not Emily. It came from Richard Hayes himself. Steger called Emily at 6:15 on a Thursday evening, and she could tell from the first syllable that this was not a routine update call. There was something in his voice, not excitement exactly, but the controlled alertness of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of the thing he's been working on. "Hayes came in today," Steger said. "Through his own attorney. He wants to settle." Emily sat down. She was standing in the kitchen when the call came, and she sat down at the kitchen table with her hand flat on the surface the same way she'd sat the night of the rainy receipt counting the gap to rent. "He wants to settle," she repeated. "He wants to avoid the Department of Labor formal finding and whatever criminal referral might follow from it. His attorney made contact this afternoon proposing a private settlement covering all affected employees, full restitution of documented wage theft, and tip pool discrepancies, plus a penalty amount." Steger paused. "Emily, the number he's proposing is significant. Dalton's ownership group would match it from their own liability exposure, which their counsel has advised them to do. The combined figure would be," he named a number. Emily heard it and said nothing for a moment. "Emily, I'm here," she said. She stopped. "Say it again." He said it again. She had not, in 11 years of working the floor of the Blue Pine Diner, ever held a number that large in a conversation that had her name attached to it. Not her name specifically, it was the combined total for all affected employees, but her name was part of it. Her 11 years were part of it. Her 67 pages and her shoebox and her 3 years of careful notation were part of what had made that number possible. "Is it enough?" Emily asked. "For everyone? It covers every documented claim with interest. The former employees with the largest gaps, including the 4 who left without final checks, receive priority distribution as you requested." A pause. "Your portion, Emily, accounting for 11 years of documented tip discrepancies and unauthorized deductions is," he named a second number. This one was smaller than the total personal specific to her, and it was still more than she had made in the best year she'd ever had at the diner, and she sat at her kitchen table in the particular silence of a woman whose math had been running wrong for so long that the right answer didn't feel real yet. "Can I have a day," she said, "before I respond?" "Of course. I want to call the others first. Before I say yes to anything, I want to make sure they're satisfied with the terms." Another pause. Longer. "Emily," Steger said, and his voice had the quality she'd heard once before, the quality from the day he'd said that notebook may be the single most important piece of evidence in this case. "I've been practicing law for 27 years. I want you to know that in 27 years, I have never once had a client ask to consult the other plaintiffs before accepting a settlement on their own behalf." He paused. "I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She said thank you and hung up and sat at the table for a moment by herself. Then she called Kayla. Then Dale. Then the 2 people Dex had found who'd left without checks, a woman named Patricia and a man named Stephen, both of whom she'd spoken to only once before in Steger's conference room, but who felt in the specific way of people who have been through something together, not like strangers. Every one of them said yes. Every one of them said it without hesitation. Patricia cried briefly, then apologized for crying, then said she was not actually sorry and was going to cry if she felt like it because she'd been owed this for 6 years and she'd earned the right to cry about it. Emily agreed completely. She called Steger back the next morning and said yes. "What term?" Jack came to Laurel the day the settlement was finalized. He didn't announce it. He just showed up at the diner at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, sitting in a corner booth with a coffee when Emily came in for her shift, and she saw him there and stopped walking for a full second before she continued toward him and slid into the seat across from his. "You didn't have to drive all the way here," she said. I know, he said. I wanted to. They sat across from each other in the same diner where 5 wet, grieving men had walked in from a rainstorm 6 weeks ago, and the morning light came through the windows, and Ruth moved behind the counter, pretending not to watch them, which she was completely doing, and the jukebox played something low and unhurried, and it felt, Emily thought, like the kind of morning that knows it's the end of something and the beginning of something else simultaneously. How's Sarah? Emily asked. Both are wet, Danny's wife. She'd asked about her every time she spoke to Jack because it felt wrong not to. Harder days than easier ones, Jack said. But she's got people around her now. Marcus is over there twice a week. The chapter has a fund set up for the kids. She's not alone in it. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Her daughter asked about Danny last week, the 5-year-old. She asked her mom if Daddy was ever going to come back from heaven for a visit. His jaw moved. Sarah called me after, and we talked for an hour, and neither of us had the right thing to say, but we stayed on the phone anyway because that's what you do. That's exactly what you do, Emily said. I told Sarah about you, Jack said, early on, about the receipt, about what came after. She said, he stopped, looked at his coffee. She said Danny would have wanted us to find someone like you, that he was always saying the world had good people in it that nobody was paying enough attention to. That was his thing. Even at 28, he believed that. Emily felt the familiar tightening in her throat that Danny Osgood produced in her. This young man she had never met, who had died on Highway 90 before she knew his name existed, who had somehow been present in everything that had happened since that rainy night, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, but felt with complete certainty. Tell me something about him, Emily said. Not about the accident, not about the grief, just something about who he was. Jack looked at her, and the grief in his face was still there. Would always be there, but something else was there too now. Something that had been allowed to coexist with the grief without being crowded out by it. He made terrible coffee, Jack said. The worst coffee you've ever had in your life. And he made it at every chapter event, every ride, every gathering for 3 years. And every time someone told him it was bad, he would look genuinely surprised, like he could not understand why the coffee wasn't working, and then he'd make the exact same coffee the next time. A small, real, unguarded smile crossed Jack's face. By the end, we all just drank it, because it was Danny's coffee and we loved him so. Emily smiled too, and it was the kind of smile that happens when grief and love occupy the same space, and neither one cancels the other out. Terrible coffee is a good legacy, she said. Worst I ever had, Jack agreed. I would give anything to have a cup of it right now. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them in the morning quiet of the diner. Then Jack reached into his vest pocket and put something on the table between them. A small laminated photograph, edges worn soft from handling. The young man she'd glimpsed that first night, early 30s, wide grin arms slung around a motorcycle like it was an old friend. Danny Osgood, Jack said. I wanted you to know his face. He deserves to be known. Emily picked up the photograph carefully. She looked at Danny Osgood for a long moment, his grin, his easy posture, the particular brightness in his eyes of someone who believes in the world he's standing in. He looks like someone who made terrible coffee on purpose, she said, just to see who would drink it anyway. Jack laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully without qualification, and it transformed his face the same way his smile had. The grief was still there, but it was making room. It was being asked to share the space, and it was learning slowly how. You might be right about that, he said. Emily set the photograph back on the table between them, careful like something that deserved handling with both hands. I want to keep it here, she said, on the counter, if that's all right, so people can see his face. Jack looked at the photograph, then at Emily. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was rough in the way it got when he was choosing not to look away from something that cost him something to look at. He'd have liked that, Jack said. He'd have liked this place. He'd have liked you. I think I'd have liked him too, Emily said. Terrible coffee and all. The diner changed in the months that followed, the way things change when the weight that was pressing on them is finally lifted and they're allowed to find their own natural shape. Joan Pressler stayed on as permanent manager after a conversation with Frank Dalton, in which she apparently made a list of 12 things she required to do the job properly, and Dalton agreed to all 12 without negotiation because he was a businessman who had learned an expensive lesson about what happens when you don't listen to the people running your properties, and he wasn't interested in learning it twice. Ruth got the raise she should have gotten 3 years ago. She found out about it on a Wednesday on her paycheck without being told in advance, and she stood in the parking lot staring at the number for a full minute before she went back inside and told Emily, and Emily said she knew. And Ruth said, "How long have you known?" And Emily said, "A week," and Ruth said, "Emily Ann Carter?" "I have opinions about that," and Emily said, "Noted," and they went back to work. The tip pool was restructured with full transparency shared spreadsheet, every employee with access, Joan reviewing it personally every week. The first Friday after the new system was implemented, 3 waitresses stood in the back hallway after close comparing their totals, from memory to what the sheet showed and the numbers matched, for the first time any of them could clearly remember. And the silence that followed that discovery was the specific silence of people processing the realization of how long they'd been shorted and choosing to focus on the fact that it was over. Emily's hours went back to 39 a week and then to 42. When Joan asked if she'd be willing to take on a partial shift supervisor role 3 mornings a week, a small additional responsibility with a corresponding bump in pay, Emily said yes because yes was the right answer and because it turned out good at it. Good at the particular work of keeping a floor running smoothly, of knowing where the pressure was building before it became a problem, of reading a room full of people and understanding what each one needed before they articulated it. This, she thought, was probably a skill she'd been developing for 11 years, just under a manager who'd had no interest in seeing it. Tyler started at Bridger Technical College in September. Emily drove him there herself on the first day, the two of them in the properly running, mechanically sound Corolla that no longer rattled, and she sat in the parking lot after he'd gotten out with his backpack and watched him walk toward the building. This tall, quiet boy who had his father's directness and his mother's stubbornness and his own particular patience with complicated things, and she thought about the deposit that had been secured by 300 people splitting $500, and about the check engine light that had been dark for 4 months, and about the fact that she was no longer doing impossible arithmetic in her head when she drove anywhere. Tyler turned back at the door and found her still sitting there and gave her the particular look of a 17-year-old who understands exactly why his mother is still in the parking lot and has decided to be gracious about it. He raised one hand in a small wave. She waved back. Then he went inside and she drove to work. On a Saturday in October, 6 months after the night of the rain, Jack Mercer rode into Laurel again. Not with 300 bikes. Just himself alone on a clear fall morning when the cold had the particular crispness of Montana October, that specific clean sharpness that makes the air feel like something you could hold in your hands. He came to the diner. Emily was working this morning shift. She saw him come through the door the same way she'd seen him that first night, a leather vest gray, beard boots on the linoleum. But everything about the moment was different from that night. The weight was different. His shoulders sat differently. The grief was still present in his face because it would always be present. You didn't lose a Danny Osgood and come back from it entirely, but it was settled differently now, integrated, carried differently. The way Emily had told Marcus on the porch of the diner in the rain, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed. He sat at the counter. Emily poured him a coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around it, the same gesture she'd seen the first night, and looked at her across the counter. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant it in a long time. "Really good, Jack." He nodded, looked at the counter. "I drove past the place on 90, he said, "where Danny's accident happened. First time I've gone that way since the funeral." Emily waited. "I stopped for a minute," he said. "Just sat there, and I thought about what you said to Marcus that night on the porch, about letting it make you gentler instead of harder." He turned his coffee cup slowly. "I've been trying. Every day, I've been trying." He looked up at her. "Some days are harder to be gentle on than others." "I know," Emily said. "That's what trying means." "I talked to Sarah last week," he said. "She asked me if I thought Danny knew how much he was loved. I said yes, he knew, he always knew, because we showed him every chance we got. And she said that's the only thing that actually helps when she's having the hardest days. Knowing he knew." He paused. "I thought about that for a while, about showing people while you still can that they matter." He reached across the counter, then not with a handshake this time, but with his open palm up, an offering rather than a grip, and Emily put her hand in his. The same way she'd take anything that's being extended to you, honestly. You changed something, Jack said. What you did, not just for us, not just for the people in this diner. You changed something in me and in Marcus and in how some people think about what they're capable of doing for each other. His voice was steady and deliberate and completely sincere. I don't know how to say that adequately. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for 6 months. You just did, Emily said. He smiled, the full one, the one that made room for everything at once. Emily looked at the counter where Danny Osgood's laminated photograph sat in a small stand she'd made from a piece of wire tucked between the sugar dispenser and the napkin holder. Danny grinning at the camera arm around his motorcycle, absolutely certain the world was worth believing in. She looked at Jack, at Ruth moving behind the pie case humming, at the morning regulars in their usual spots, George at the counter with his coffee, the couple from the motel in booth 2 who'd been coming every weekend for a month. At Joan Pressler in the office with the door open, the way she always kept it doing paperwork, with the particular calm competence of a woman who ran a clean ship because she believed in running a clean ship. She thought about $56, about a receipt torn in half on a rainy night, by a woman who knew exactly what $56 cost her, and chose to give it anyway, not because she could afford it, but because the moment required it, and she was the person standing in the moment. She thought about Kayla, who had called because a story made her feel like the world might be different than she'd thought. About Dale Hutchins sleeping 8 hours a night. About Grace Hutchins's letter in the back of her dresser drawer, which she'd read 4 times. About Tyler in his second month at Bridger, calling her on Thursday evenings to describe what he'd learned that week, with the specific delighted precision of someone doing exactly what they were built to do. About Marcus, who texted her occasionally brief and slightly awkward, in the way of young men who are still learning how to maintain connections they care about. And every text said something that amounted to, I'm still trying to be gentler instead of harder. About Sarah Osgood, who Emily had finally called 2 months ago, the two of them talking for an hour and a half, the way Jack had described no right things to say, staying on the phone anyway, because that was what you did. She thought about all of it, the full shape of what a single choice made without witnesses in an empty diner on a rainy night had become when it was allowed to travel. You know what I think about, Emily said to Jack, when I think about that night? I think about how close I came to doing the reasonable thing instead. She looked at him directly. How close every one of us comes every day to choosing the version of ourselves that's scared instead of the version that isn't. And how the whole difference every time is about 2 seconds. The 2 seconds between knowing what the right thing is and talking yourself out of it. She paused. I almost talked myself out of it. I want you to know that. It wasn't easy. It wasn't automatic. I stood there with that receipt and I did the math on how much I couldn't afford it, and I almost put it down. But you didn't, Jack said. But I didn't, Emily said. And I think that's the whole story, really. Not that I was brave enough to do it, just that I was stubborn enough not to stop. Jack looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came through the diner windows and fell across the counter, warm and clear, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they're worth looking at. Danny would have said that's the same thing, he said. Maybe it is, Emily said. She picked up the coffee pot and topped off his cup, and he wrapped his hands around it again. And outside the diner, the ordinary world continued its ordinary motion, and inside it, the people who had found each other through grief and rain and a $56 bill sat together in the particular piece of those who have been through something and come out the other side carrying each other. A woman who had nothing left to give, had given everything she had, and the world had not let that go unwitnessed, had not let it go unreturned, had not let the quiet courage of an ordinary Tuesday night remain only between herself and 5 strangers in leather jackets. Kindness, it turned out, did not stay where you left it. It traveled. It grew. It arrived on motorcycles at dawn. It appeared in parking lots and law offices and recovery checks in a 5-year-old girl's birthday in 8 hours of sleep for a man who hadn't slept right in 3 years in a teenager walking through the door of the school he was always supposed to attend in a photograph on a diner counter so that a young man who believed in the world would be seen by every person who sat down for coffee and maybe, just maybe, believe in it a little too. Emily Carter had torn a receipt in half on a rainy night in Montana, and it had been the bravest and most ordinary thing she had ever done, and it had changed everything, and she would do it again without hesitation every single time, because that was who she was, and that in the end was enough. That had always been exactly enough.